Hi everyone, welcome to my next video. This video is going to be on the second Bee Gees album called Spicks and Specks. This was released in 1966 in Australia only. And some of the singles were actually released overseas, for example, Germany, the following year, once they broke out, songs like Spicks and Specks. And they were released as singles, but initially it was only released in Australia, and most of these songs were only ever really heard by Australians or hardcore fans because they never really made international hits. This is a very important record though, make no mistake about it. This has to be one of the most underrated and significant albums of the 1960s. That's saying a lot because the 1960s was the era when, everyone was being influenced by everyone. We had globalization happening for the first time in history. And of course, music was changing forever and influences were going to echo on for generations. And that's what we're experiencing in 2020 still and beyond. There is one song on this album which deserves to be, talked about in that way. And that song is Monday's Rain. It's the first track. Monday's Rain is blue-eyed soul music, okay? It wasn't maybe called that just yet, but Bee Gees, along with their US counterparts, the Rascals, pretty much invented blue-eyed soul. What is blue-eyed soul? It's hard to say. What is soul? It's very hard to say, but basically, the way I put it is soul music is black. It's black music, and it's based on their roots, the slave roots and suffering and all, it's about feeling things deeply and expressing them through art. That's what soul, I guess, in a nutshell is. And white artists couldn't do soul. It was pretty much accepted, that they couldn't do soul music. It was something else when the Beatles were doing, a cover of the Isley Brothers, Twist and Shout. It wasn't really soul anymore. It was more rock or rock and roll. The Bee Gees sort of changed that, and it was okay. They really raised the bar. So the Bee Gees, as I said, and the Rascals in America, were doing music that kind of tied those threads together of black and white music. It wasn't like a competition of what was better. It was more like getting best of both worlds. And the Rascals were a little bit more edgy in that year. They were a bit more like, like Otis Redding, Sam and Dave. The Bee Gees were a bit softer. But by the next year, even the Rascals were starting to do songs like Groovin', and you probably heard Groovin' because it's on every 60s compilation ever made, and it's still played on radio. And that song is really the Rascals' version of Monday's Rain. And a couple of years later, Tommy James and the Shondells did a song called Crystal Blue Persuasion. And I wonder if he was listening to the Bee Gees' Monday's Rain. That is a very significant song, by the way, because that song really raised the bar for the entire 1970s blue-eyed soul. And, every band, whether they be rock, like Doobie Brothers, or experimental band like Steely Dan, all had a bit of that blue-eyed soul. Or whatever you want to call it. Some call it, I guess, there was a great series a few years ago called Too Slow to Disco. And that really captured the essence of what I'm talking about. Those 70s bands that did that kind of white soul, but not on a disco level, more of a FM radio perhaps. Anyway, the Bee Gees, I think Monday's Rain cannot be understated because they really, bring in the best of both worlds. and they invent something new. And to this day, we've got artists like Justin Timberlake who do that kind of music. On the black side, we have Rihanna and Beyonce. You know, you can't really put them in a box and say this is white, this is black. They're kind of intertwined, and that's what Monday's Rain is. But I don't want to just focus on the one song. There is of course Spicks and Specks. Spicks and Specks was their first #1, and I love it. That's a bit of an anthem. That song is an anthem. What you got to understand is this is a period when the Bee Gees were getting tired, if you like, of Australia. Australia wasn't really giving them the hits that they were hoping to get. So they made a decision to go overseas and to make a big band. Thankfully, their producer at the time, Nat Kipner, tore up their contract and basically gave him his blessing to go to England, and that's what they did. And on that cruise to England, they discovered they had a #1 hit with Spicks and Specks. Spicks and Specks is more of a rock anthem of the 1960s. It's amazing. It's not really what you associate the Bee Gees with normally. It's a real good rock anthem, and you can see that in audience reactions in the back in the day. That they really dug the Bee Gees as a rock band when that song was performed, and that song has also been as part of a theme show in a Spicks and Specks TV quiz show that's been around since 2003 and still around, still very popular television in Australia. What's interesting is that Kipner, who I just mentioned, he came to Australia from America on his Navy ship, and then he found his wife-to-be in Queensland, and he moved here. So there's an interesting pattern where the Bee Gees always meet people who are from overseas, or they're going to move overseas with the Bee Gees. So they were on quite a journey. So there's like Robert Stigwood, who's an expat of Australia, who they meet in England. And Nat Kipner, who's from America, comes to Australia and basically produces this amazing piece of work. And then, of course, there are the people they hang out with. People like the Easy Beats, who moved to England to make it big about the same time, maybe a little bit earlier than the Bee Gees. Then there's Brian Cadd, a friend of theirs, and there's Johnny Young. There's lots of others probably as well. Brian Cadd is an interesting name in the Bee Gees history because Brian Cadd was a mate, and he also did a fantastic touching tribute with Marsha Hines and others when Morris died, and they raised money for charity with that song, To Love Somebody. But all these people they hang out with all seem to go to England with the Bee Gees, and when they're in England they meet Australians like Robert Stigwood, which we'll get into in the next video. So yeah, if not for Nat, can you imagine what the Bee Gees would be like? Nat could have said, no, you're not going to England, you're going to fulfill your contract here in Australia. That would have been a disaster for the Bee Gees, because the Bee Gees really needed to be in England, where it was all happening. At the time it was all happening, right in the middle of the psychedelic and flower power movement. This is where they really get their, I guess, as they say, cut their teeth. That's where they really form the cast of what they were going to become, at least for the next 5 years anyway. And but you can imagine if the Bee Gees missed that very popular, those heady days of 1967 and 68, and joined in the hit parade just a little bit later, could you imagine how disastrous that could have been for the Bee Gees? Because they really needed that first wave of international success, which they had with Massachusetts, their first #1, To Love Somebody, and the list goes on and on and on and on. And one of my favourite, Every Christian Lion-Hearted Man. Those were the songs that they did on their first international album, which is their third album. We'll talk about that in the next video. And it's completely different again. They become a lot more psychedelic, a lot more driven by, classical instruments and things like that. So yeah, this is a huge departure from their previous album, which was amateur, compared to this. Amateur songs, this is more experiment. There's experimentation, there's more instruments. For example, there's a trumpet here. I forget his name, but there's a trumpeter here. Robin sings Glass House, fantastic song where he uses his opera voice for the first time. Operatic style voice, I should say. And there's also a mellotron or some other instrument very similar to a mellotron in it in Glass House, which I think is amazing. Jingle Jangle, another song where Robin, stretches his voice to that of an opera singer. There's also Garage with Born a Man, Where Are You, How Many Birds, Big Chance. There's sort of like light garage songs, especially Born a Man. Yeah, that's really, really good. Quite rebellious too. What more can I tell you? I mean, yeah. I love Robin Gibb, and his songs are Secondhand People he sings. I don't know why I bother with myself. Jingle Jangle, as I mentioned. And Glass House. Those are all sung by Robin Gibb. And also, I have to say that this is the first album where there's actual collaboration now between the band. Whereas on their first album, it was all Barry by himself. Now you've got Robin and you've got Morris all contributing, especially Robin. And yeah, Robin is so underrated. By the way, Nat Kipner is the guy who writes the liner notes. His son, I'll read you some of those liner notes because I think they're quite interesting. But his son, Steve Kipner, worked with a psychedelic band called Tin Tin, which I was lucky enough to go and see live about 10 or 15 years ago. And he worked with Tin Tin and a few other really progressive bands, 69, 70. And interestingly enough, Morris Gibb of the Bee Gees produced their first album and played bass on it. So, Tin Tin are a really good band, which you should definitely look out for. They're still yet to team up with Colin Peterson and Vince Maloney. That was the following year, and they became, fourth and fifth members of the band. Here in the liner notes, it says Barry, Morris and Robin have been around for quite some time. Yeah, they've actually been around for 6 years already. This is, by the way, what the back cover looks like. They've been around for 6 years, 3 of those years doing TV shows, performing on TV shows, I should say, even having a TV show themselves. I've never actually seen that show, but legend has it they actually had their own TV show at the age of, when Barry was 14 and the twins would have been about 11. So can you imagine that? But 1963 was the year they started releasing singles. So as a recording act, they were around for 3 years. With only minor forays into the pop limelight. Gee, that's an understatement for sure. But recently they burst out in a virtual blaze of glory with their latest single, Spicks and Specks, and I Am the World. By the way, I Am the World is another Robin Gibb classic. He even put it on his posthumous album in 2014. He did a new version of it, and from his album 50 St. Catherine Drive, St. Catherine Drive, which I believe is the address of where he lives. And I Am the World has snared the Merit Award in several states, and he's he's talking about Spicks and Specks, and is at this moment poised ready to take chart honours nationally. Cram-packed into 3 Gibb boys are a myriad of musical abilities. As instrumentalists, they have mastered practically every instrument in the book. That's certainly true for Morris Gibb. He loves his instruments. He could play everything. As harmonists and vocalists, they are acknowledged as the foremost in this country. That's quite generous of Nat. As writers, they have won many awards, and many artists, both locally and overseas, owe a great measure of their success to the wonderful composition of primarily Barry, but lately Morris and Robin, which was what I was saying before. As for personality and stage presentation, their act is a sight to behold. Just to describe them as pop artists would not be sufficient, as they are in fact entertainers of the first order. This album is made up of a great variety of compositions and will certainly give you, the listener, a vivid insight into the sparkling personalities of Australia's top vocal group, the Bee Gees. Alright, I think I've run out of things to say, but this is an amazing record. Go and buy the CD if you can. The record's probably a bit pricey, but you can probably buy the box set with the 3 first albums. Yeah, very much recommended.